Hello, this is Dan Klein for the January 2025 EJW podcast, and I'm excited to talk with Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. Thank you for talking with me, Professor Sachs. How are you
Happy,
today?
Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us. Um, Professor Sachs's influence is enormous and his areas of research are very diverse. I'll give a bio, but let me say something about why I'm so excited to be talking to Professor Sachs. I've become highly interested in the deep state and American foreign policy and watch channels on which he is a regular guest, including Judge Napolitano's Judging Freedom and the Duran. For today, I hope to ask Professor Sachs about being an economist, the economics profession, his own ideological outlook, and whether he feels he's undergone any kind of ideological migration, and foreign policy, especially with respect to Russia. Does that sound good, or is there anything else you think we should try to get to today?
That sounds like a lot of ground, so let's get into it.
All right. So, for my own benefit, if no one else's, I've got a bio to read. Professor Sachs grew up in the Detroit metro area and went to Harvard for 3 econ degrees, then a faculty appointment, and tenure and full professorship at, get this, the age of 28. During 2 decades while on the faculty at Harvard, he led the Harvard Institute for International Development and Center for International Development, advised Bolivia in a profound way, then Poland, and then other post-communist societies. He is identified with the expression shock therapy for transitioning economies. With Andrew Warner, he formulated an influential theory about openness and property rights being sufficient to become a convergent economy. In 2002, he moved to his current home institution, Columbia, to lead the Earth Institute, where he founded the Millennium Villages Project and then the Center for Sustainable Development. In 2005, he published the blockbuster The End of Poverty and followed that up with Commonwealth: Economics for a Crowded Planet. He's been an advisor on econ and development issues to officials all over the world, it seems. In 2012, he published a book about domestic U.S. issues subtitled Reawakening American Virtue and Prosperity, and in 2018, another on domestic issues, which featured a foreword by Bernie Sanders. In 2020, he published a deeply historical book titled The Ages of Globalization. I have to mention that I looked up Professor Sachs's Google site count, and it's about 171,000, which is a heck of a lot. Back in 2014, we see perhaps a marker, perhaps you can tell me whether this is right, of a transition from a focus on ending poverty to a focus on ending war, with a book subtitled JFK's Quest for Peace. And in 2020, another book, A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism. Professor Sachs is now profoundly counter-narrative on several fronts, most especially foreign policy. There's so much in your career, Professor Sachs. Is there anything you'd like to add by way of background?
Thank you for that summary. That's very nice.
All right. So about just being an economist, I figured this was a good opportunity, and since we're Econ Journal Watch, let me share a thought and then a question.
Yep.
I see a certain parallel between you and one of my heroes, Thomas Schelling, in that both of you seem more interested in being an advisor and hence really making a difference than a celebrated economist. Like you both have the attitude, I'm going to do things my way, and if my fellow economists don't like it, so be it. One difference from Schelling is that you advise not only government elites, but the public at large, something which Schelling did to a much lesser extent and much less outspokenly. Any thoughts on that comparison?
Well, I appreciate it because Tom Schelling was a wonderful economist and a wonderful person and a wonderful friend whom I knew at Harvard. So I naturally like you're linking me with him. He was indeed a government advisor. I think a difference for me is that I've advised mostly governments in other places of the world, not the U.S. government, although I kibitz with the U.S. government and have done so relentlessly for more than 40 years. But my formal advisory activities have been around the world. And that, of course, also for me explains some of my attitudes towards the U.S. I tend to see the U.S. from the outside looking in rather than from the inside looking out. And I've never been, nor have I ever desired to be an advisor to the U.S. government per se. I got interested in the world at large early on. I believe in a world of peace and prosperity. And so I tend not to be very interested in one country's patriotic appeals versus another, but rather how we can function together.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Any thoughts on the idea that you're going to do it your own way, and whether your fellow economists like it and kind of like applaud it? Like, that's secondary.
Look, life's short. I want to get things right. That's my main idea. I think trying to be as accurate as I can be, trying to understand things as accurately as I can be, experiencing things on the ground has made a big difference for me. One of my life-changing experiences was being engaged in a practical problem solving for the first time at a high level in 1985 in Bolivian hyperinflation. And when I was involved and I made some policy recommendations that I think worked out pretty well, my colleagues said, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Which was fair enough, but I found the points, frankly, quite naive because I was there watching and participating close up, and they were kibitzing from several thousand miles away. And I found it quite limiting. So my whole intellectual strategy for it's now basically 40 years from 1985 till today has been to keep one foot firmly in academia and conceptualization and theory, and one foot very much planted in practice in the world. And each one helps me to inform the other side. So theory and practice, to my mind, are completely complementary. They are not in the slightest way even conceivably antagonistic. And at least for me, I couldn't figure things out theoretically. I need the practical evidence in front of me, and then I try to make sense of it. I very much like the old expression attributed to Walter Heller, the policy economist of the 1960s, who purportedly said that an economist is someone who, when he sees that something works in theory, in practice, tries to find out if it works in theory. And I like that direction of logic. See if it works in something that's working in practice, try to conceptualize it and understand it. So in any event, that's been my approach to knowledge and understanding. Be deeply engaged in practical problem solving and try to conceptualize what it is you're actually doing in that process.
Yeah. I think that fueled Schelling's great insights and developments. So who are some of your favorite economists? First pre-20th century. Anybody you want to mention?
Well, I'm a confirmed Aristotelian, so though Aristotle is not typically counted as an economist, he did, of course, write about economics. He wrote about everything. And so I'm a great admirer of Aristotle in many different dimensions. I'm a huge fan of Adam Smith because I think both the 1759, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and 1776, The Wealth of Nations, are two of the finest books about society ever written. I have my quibbles and qualms, and also my observations about ways that Smith has been interpreted or reinterpreted subsequently. But of course, he's an absolute giant. There are many giants. We all need them as our guides. In the 20th century, by far, the economist that I have most admired and tried to emulate in certain ways is John Maynard Keynes. By emulate, I don't mean to be Keynes. I mean to follow the methodology that he advised, that he prescribed. And one of the most notable points about his methodology in his eulogy to Alfred Marshall was to say that an economist should be a multifaceted individual that could touch theory and practice together, that could be both mathematical and practical, that could be, I think, I don't remember his exalted language exactly, but, reaching to the heavens, but also as down to earth as the politician. And I really like that idea of the mix of talents that is useful for good economics.
Is there anyone else in the 20th century you want to?
Well, I had two absolute geniuses as immediate influences on me. Being a student in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Paul Samuelson absolutely dominated the scene. He was just a great genius, an absolute remarkable mind. And his brother-in-law and fellow genius,
No.
Kenneth Arrow, the absolute, probably the greatest polymath that I met in the economics profession, because while Samuelson knew everything about economics, about history, about every theorem, about every personality in economics, Arrow seemed to know everything about everything about everything. And when I was an undergraduate student at Harvard, I invited Arrow to lunch because we would be encouraged to invite our faculty to lunch. And he asked me about my courses, which included some literature courses, some history courses, some anthropology courses, some math courses, and so forth. Every single thing I touched on, he went off into a complete, absolute, remarkable discussion at depth. And it was a lasting impression. And I had another similar impression walking with him in Venice, actually, at a conference. And every street corner, he told the history of some event, some revolution, some personality. He was just an incredible polymath, and both of them were extremely kind people, and had a huge inspirational impact on me, I would say, as a young student. Simon Kuznets was another wonderful individual who a bit took me under his wing when I was an undergraduate, and I would visit him at his home. He was an emeritus professor at that point, and he told me about the origins of GDP accounting and the purposes. And remember, Jeff, GDP is not a measure of well-being, and it was never meant to be a measure of well-being, and many lessons. Ken Galbraith was also extraordinarily kind giant of a mentor for me early on in my undergraduate days. So for me, coming from Detroit, arriving at Harvard, and immediately falling into the orbits of Samuelson, Solow, Arrow, Kuznets, and many others was, of course, such a life-changing, wonderful experience.
Wow. Thanks for sharing. You mentioned a bit about how economists shouldn't be kind of confined to their field. And that certainly had been a trend for, I would say, centuries, right? But not necessarily a good one, I gather you feel.
Well, there's room for specialization and there's room for generalization. I'm a generalist, and others are specialists, and you need both. You need very deep dives, and you need people who can help put the pieces together. I spend most of my time at the intersection of fields, I would say, trying to understand the intersection of Earth's physical systems, engineering, the macroeconomy, the social economy, and so forth. I've spent 25 years trying to build a field, which I call sustainable development, which comes from the phrase sustainable development, but I want it to be an academic field, meaning that it is an integrated study of physical, engineered, political, economic, and social systems and how they fit together. Because I think we need that kind of broad understanding. Maybe it's what an ecologist does for the natural world, not a specialist on any particular species, but on how they cohere together. And for me, that is important. There is a trade-off, there's no question. Economists are right, there's such thing as scarcity, the scarcity of our attention, our skill sets, and so forth. And if you become a generalist, you gain certain skills and you forego others. And if you are a deep specialist, you can make very deep dives into areas, but you hope that your deep dive interconnects in a meaningful way with the rest of our world. So I've chosen the generalist approach, and for me it also means a sense of that I'm a permanent grad student, because I'm always learning new fields, always trying to learn new fields, always believing, I'm going to spend some time trying to understand something that I really didn't have my professional training in or my publications in, but that is absolutely important to get right. And I led an organization called the Earth Institute at Columbia for around 15 years, which was hundreds of leading scholars from across Columbia's faculties, but including climate scientists, civil engineers, economists, political scientists, psychologists, sociologists. And a lot of my fun was learning a bit about each of their fields, but also gaining the unique opportunity when a question, say, about climatology came up, to be able to speak directly with one of the world's leading climatologists to get the lowdown on the topic, or with engineers who could help me to understand how the power grid works and so forth. And having that kind of generalist knowledge is really important, in my view, for a lot of the core policy making that needs to be done in the world today. And it's generally lacking that kind of general integrative knowledge.
Any general remarks about the econ profession today that you'd like to share?
Well, I wanted to do better in many ways. I wanted to be more problem solving. I wanted to be more grounded in ideas of what is a good society. I think it can't just be, as Milton Friedman wrote in 1953 a positive field where the goal is prediction above everything else. I think it has to be a field oriented towards the good more than it is actually. I often think, because my wife is a medical doctor and I watched her train in medical school and through her residencies and specializations and so forth, what would it be like if a medical school said, we study disease, we try to predict the course of disease, but our job isn't really to intervene and choose something called health or not health. It would be quite interesting. You'd go into the hospital and the doctor would predict, well, you'll be dead in 7 days. We have very good forecasting capacities. Well, what about saving me, doctor? No, that's not really my field. That's a value judgment. I don't want to get too involved in that. I find that approach to economics not sensible.
Okay. I'd like to ask about your ideology and whether if you feel it's undergone any change. And this is rather apart from foreign policy, just to kind of imagine more of an economist looking at the national economy, domestic policy. And there's a lot in your career that points in favor of individual liberty and free markets. On the other hand, in a recent podcast, you called Franklin Roosevelt our greatest president. And yet you get on great with Napolitano. That's where you said that. And I believe he's a libertarian. It's great to get on with everybody. It's not like a big deal, just like with Tucker Carlson. In an interview with him, you said the Biden administration has been the worst of our governments in modern history. And you said very favorable things about Rand Paul as well as Tulsi Gabbard. And you kind of express a hope about the incoming Trump presidency in terms of a foreign policy change. So, I'm not trying to be tricky or anything.
No, I understand.
Yeah. And
first, I don't like the normal categories.
Yeah, I just want to add, from my part, I don't see a lot of, if you will, very, like you talked about your amazing pedigree at Harvard and everything, and like a lot of people like you who, would say that about the Biden administration publicly. So I just wonder, what do you make of yourself?
First, the main change is I know more than I used to, because when I got into economics, I knew almost nothing. And in fact, I got into economics because I was kind of amazed at how little I understood about almost anything about our economy or our society. And I wanted to understand. So this has been now a 53-year venture because I started as a student in 1972 in economics in the fall of 1972. And I'm still learning. So this is the first point. Second, I'm skeptical of all labels. They are, of course, some people do pride themselves on bearing a particular label. I'm skeptical that there's very much depth in that approach. Words like capitalism, socialism, liberty, market economy, and so forth, they can mean a lot of different things. These are big, vague terms. Third, as an Aristotelian, as I mentioned, Aristotle praised a mixed form of government when he came down to his analytics of politics in the politics. He talked about government of the one, government which could be of a good or bad form. It could be a monarchy or it could be a despot. A government of the few, it could be of a good form, an aristocracy, government of the best, or an oligarchy, or a government of the many. It could be mob rule or it could be republicanism. He made 2 points. One, the formal structures don't define the quality of the outcomes. This is one of his genius points, that it's debating the formal structure of the economy leaves a lot out. Second, he advocated a mixed form of government. Take some of the government of the ones, some of the government of the few, some of the government of the many, because different kinds of problems require different kinds of organization. This is true of an economy. One of the things I learned from and love about Paul Samuelson's approach to economics was he said there are private goods and there are public goods. And he defined rigorously the difference of the two, which I think is one of the most eye-opening developments of economics in the 20th century, that we could actually identify in which cases individual behavior would lead to desirable outcomes, such as Pareto efficiency, and in which cases that would not be true. And those are partly due to the technical character of a particular good or service, whether it's rival or non-rival, whether it's excludable or non-excludable. So I think we owe a lot to Samuelson for clarifying these basic concepts. And I always loved the field of public economics in particular, because public economics defined when do markets work well, when don't they work well, when should we use auctions, when should we use normal market mechanisms, why are there firms? All these great classic questions of the 20th century show that the economy is much more than a convex set of preferences and technological transformation curves that lead to the first and second welfare theorems. So in this sense, we need a richer institutional understanding. So that's why I find all of the kind of tendentious ideological discussions off base. And it's interesting for me. I advised the Polish government in 1989. I think I made good recommendations. They set and staged decades of rapid economic catch-up for Poland, which was exactly the idea that I had in mind. So it wasn't an ex post observation. It was an ex ante desideratum. But when I made the recommendations, they thought, well, this guy's a super liberal free market economist, shock therapy, extreme liberalism. And I said, come on, are you kidding? That's not me at all. But if you start with the Soviet economy, what the hell are you going to do? You're going to liberalize. If you start the other direction, maybe you're going to go in the other direction. Okay. So I found myself constantly typecast or misunderstood or oversimplified in the public media. Okay, who can, no time to complain, but just as a sociological observation, what you're painted as is often pretty weird compared to what you believe. The idea that, well, I was a free market radical and then I had a conversion on the road to Damascus when shock therapy failed and tried to make amends. Many absolutely absurd quasi-biblical allegories were stated for the few who actually cared about what I was saying.
So you don't, okay, and so you don't report any particular change in policy view, whether it's, especially I guess domestic policy we're talking about.
Not on the left-right spectrum to the extent,
or just
that
like
is
interventionist, big government, small government.
No, because I was trained. First, I went into economics to solve problems. So it was already a bit of an interventionism, I would say, as a basic philosophical position, that the world has problems and that they are solvable and should be solved. So that is a kind of maintained hypothesis for me. Second, I grew up in the milieu of the neoclassical synthesis of Samuelson and Keynes. Keynes said, you have to intervene to make the economy work. Samuelson said, yes, but don't overdo it. Markets are pretty good. And then for me, a kind of, blindingly fresh and clear insight was this public and private good distinction. Of course, it has many, many levels of sophistication to it, but the basic idea that certain things you leave to the market, other things you don't leave to the market, was not only part of my upbringing, very Samuelsonian in Cambridge, Mass. In the 1970s, but I think fundamentally correct, which is this is how a complex world is. You need often complex solutions. I would say two other big influences on me. One was at a distance, because I never met him, Jan Tinbergen, who received the Nobel Prize for targets and instruments. And that's a great idea. You set targets, you understand the economic structure, and thereby you set your instruments at the right levels. You turn the dials and the levers in the right way to achieve your targets. This is a fundamentally good, smart idea in my view. So I was very Tinbergian all my life. Another influence for me was travel, seeing other places. And one of the places I went to early on was Scandinavia. And boy, I liked what I saw. High prosperity, social democracy. There was no poverty. Everybody had health care. It seemed, whoa, how'd they figure this out? And private markets, big business, free trade. What a mix. Who thinks of Sweden, social democracy, as a free trade country? But of course it's a free trade country. Of course it's a country where the government doesn't intervene and to say don't lay off workers. It says absolutely lay off workers so that they move to more productive activities. So I came back from a trip to Sweden after my undergraduate degree, and I went to my advisor, who was Martin Feldstein, I'd say on the whole a free market-oriented economist. And I said, Marty, I'd like to write my dissertation on social democracy. And he said, nah, that's not very interesting. Go down to MIT and study international monetary economics, which I did to great benefit with Rudiger Dornbusch. And I became an international finance economist instead. But this is all to say, I was interested in social democracy. I was 25, and I found it very compelling. And in Poland in 1989, when I was asked about my supposed free market nostrums, in an interview in the New Yorker, I said to the reporter in the fall of 1989, on the verge of shock therapy, so-called, that the country I admire the most is Sweden. So the idea that this is some conversion from, hyperliberalism to interventionism is a biographical, ahistorical, let me put it that way.